Okay, hi everyone. I'm just gonna get started. So this is like my second major talk, so forgive me if it's a little bit rough. So Natama Natuk Ninyong Kurumuk, Natuk Mereng Yaragundij, Natuk Laka Pikurong. My name is Phoebe, and today I'll be talking about my perspectives on Aboriginal culture in video games and the experiences that I have had working with community on game development. Before I continue, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous custodians of the land that we gather today, the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. So just as a little bit of background, I'm a proud Indigenous woman of the Yarragunditj clan from the Maar Nation. I was born down way over in Warrnambool, which is on the south west coast of Victoria. And I have been blessed, I've been taught my culture by my father my entire life, basically. I grew up as a kid, him always teaching me dances and stories, taking me out on country and just learning everything that he was taught. So I've also spent my entire life playing video games from a very young age, thanks to my same father. He started it, he started the obsession. I started with a PlayStation 2, I believe. Sorry, Nintendo 64, but PlayStation 2 was my first console. So as the theme of GCAP this year is lighting the way, I wanted to share my views on how important it is to have Indigenous culture included in games. I hope my talk can be the starting point for everyone to think about the opportunities this can create, not just for sharing our stories or history, but also creating opportunities for Indigenous peoples within the industry, from hiring Indigenous game devs to including Indigenous communities in the process of making games. I recognise that being taught my culture since I was a kid is a huge privilege, as I know many Indigenous people do not have this same opportunity. And I hope to share what I have learnt through a new medium that I have loved since I was a kid, games. So the first point that I kind of wanted to address comes from the beginning of my journey into this industry. When working with community, my father always warned me to be really conscious of the fact that I have been privileged and that some Indigenous people may not have had that opportunity at all. They might not know anything about their own culture. So he warned me to be extremely sensitive when approaching these people as to not upset anyone. We don't want to assume that they know things and then feel like they know even less that they do. So that's just a little bit of a tip that my dad gave me when I first started coming into this. So what I'd really like to get across here is that if you are interested in creating a game or any kind of medium that is using Indigenous culture, it's really important to be mindful of people's personal histories. We don't want to create a culture of exploiting Indigenous stories and lore for financial gain in this industry, but rather help respect, preserve, and share one of the oldest living cultures on this planet. I have only been working with community in game development context, for a short period of time, thanks to Paulina and the amazing team at DragonBear Studios, who have given me the opportunity and guided me through the process. However, I have spent a lot of time involved with my community, particularly through dancing and cultural mentoring. So, DragonBear Studios are working on a fantasy game called Chaos Tavern and are embedding Indigenous culture into their game. Our core intention is to present something that is different to fantasy as a genre that is hugely westernised. We want to create something that is new to the fantasy genre by incorporating Indigenous elements and typical fantasy fundamentals. They have employed me to work on two objects: shaping the world, mythos and characters of the game within a cultural context, and consult with the Indigenous communities about the appropriateness of themes, elements and characters within the game to get a sense of what communities might like to see being showcased. This has created an opportunity to build relationships with these communities and to give them input into what they might like to be highlighted in the game. So Chaos Tavern is a fantastical reimagined Australia where the rulers of the land are the Indigenous sovereigns. The game intertwines Indigenous beliefs and laws. One example of this is the belief that the land is one of the most important things, and we must take every step to take care of it. Another is the high esteem we hold for our elders and the knowledge, and that they are the knowledge holders. An idea that came from, that's not right, sorry. An idea that came from one of my consultations was that the recognition that trees are one of the oldest living things on the earth. So they would hold a lot of knowledge. They exceed our lifespan by years, and they are there to observe everything. So what has kind of come out of this concept were these treant kind of creatures, and we thought maybe that players could come to these treants for knowledge. So here's a little clip of what we have implemented in the game so far. It's just a work in progress. So with Chaos Tavern, I was also part of the process of designing one of the Indigenous characters. This is she, her name's Taram. I worked with an Indigenous artist when coming up with her design. When imagining her, I didn't want her to be super stereotypical, but I really wanted to embrace her Aboriginal features, such as her curly hair and brown eyes. And when it came to her clothing, I also wanted it to be practical, because she is an adventurer. But again, we really wanted to stay close and have her proud and present her background. So when creating creatures for Chaos Tavern, we really wanted some more inspiration from native Australian animals, but also Indigenous stories. Through my consultations with community and elders, it was clear that we should steer away from directly referencing kind of like stories that already exist. So we don't want to take like the bunyip and just throw it in our game. And also to really steer clear from any creator spirits, and just kind of really use these as an inspiration rather than just plopping them in. So when I started my research, I looked into a bunch of stories online, and I also referenced stories that I had been told as a kid from my dad and my aunties and uncles. And I kind of took what I thought would be most interesting about these creatures, like their behaviour, and kind of tweaked it in a way that would be appropriate for our game and would work in the kind of context. So my dad told me about these little creatures. They're dark, kind of hairy little things that lurk in the darkness and kind of steal things. So I thought that would be fun. You can imagine it in a game sense where if there's some money left on the table or there's an object, like it's going to sneak out and grab it if you don't grab it within a certain amount of time. So twisting the appearances and you know, ensuring that it differs enough from the traditional stories, but you're still taking inspiration. So I've talked a little bit about what I've kind of done so far, but I really wanted to talk about how kind of to go about these processes, but this is just from my perspective. So firstly, it's really, really important to do some research into who you'll be needing to consult with. As you can see from this map, there are hundreds of language groups and clans all over Australia. Some people might not be aware of this. You may be aware, but this is just a kind of visual representation of just how many groups there are, as opposed to like one state. There's so many within that area. We are not one single generic nation or culture. And for Chaos Tavern, my thoughts were that because the game is being created out of Melbourne, it would be most appropriate to consult with people of the Kulin Nations. But it also depends on what Indigenous stories and places around Australia that you are going to take inspiration from. So, for example, if you wanted to create a game that highlights amazing Uluru, then it might be a really great idea to go and talk with those peoples that that land belongs to. And also, as a member of the Yarragunditj clan, whenever I like to use inspiration from home or any language, I'll go and consult with my elders and uncles and aunties from down there. So a little bit more into the process. When I'm approaching elders especially, or Indigenous people about doing a consultation, obviously first I'm going to ask if they're interested. I've found out that recently that games are a relatively new medium, especially to presenting our culture, and it may not be a priority for these elders or communities to engage in something like this. It may not even be something that they've considered before, so there's a bit of wariness there sometimes. So for these reasons, consulting with people has been a lot more difficult than I first anticipated. But I hope that engaging with community and helping to share culture with people and understand the opportunities can create how beneficial it can be, and hopefully more communities will be more open to this idea. But that's to say there's definitely communities and people out there who are very interested, so it just depends. So once I've agreed a time and a place for a consultation, particularly in a relaxed and informal environment, I'll then go and try to explain the game as best as I can, just as you would with anybody else, with play testers or anything, but avoiding language that is like particular game jargon, like a side-scrolling first-person shooter. Like, people who don't play games are not going to know what a side-scrolling platformer is, so really bringing it back so they understand what's happening and they'll be more receptive to what you're talking about and maybe be able to envision what you're trying to get across. And although these people may not be your target audience, their knowledge and opinions are vital to the creation of your game. So the main focus of my consultations with community and elders is to find out whether the Indigenous-inspired aspects of the game are appropriate and what we want to have in the game is presented correctly in a respectful manner. At the end, I offer the opportunity for them to suggest what they might like to see in the game, if there's anything that they think would be really great to highlight for people to understand, or maybe they want other Indigenous kids to really relate to something, or something that non-Indigenous people may get to experience in a new way. And although your game might have a completely different direction to what they're suggesting, you may receive suggestions that really work well and will help spread cultural awareness around social issues. It's especially important to keep the people you are consulting with involved throughout the entire process of making your game. This doesn't mean by any way they are like hovering over your shoulder as you're coding away or drawing the drawings to make sure like, oh, that line's not straight or anything, but, but really periodically update them on what has changed, what's been added, and how the content that they have approved or provided to you sits in context with the entire game. I'm not going to give you time frames like every couple of weeks, once a month, or anything like that. Do what works best for you in your processes and the project you're working on. But you can really use these check-ins like the ending of an iteration in your game before beginning the next one. It can cross off what's good to go and approved to leave in the game, and it'll let you know anything that maybe needs to be changed or tweaked. This will avoid getting to the end, going through another consultation and discovering that there's a lot that needs to be changed, which will create a bigger problem rather than tweaking small ones as you go. Something else that I'd really like to highlight is the importance of actually implementing the ideas that arise from your consultations. It's very easy to hire someone to do these consultations and be like, yep, that all looks fine, tick, 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 or these are the things, but not actually implement anything because they haven't really been a part of that process. They said, yes, that looks fine, but they're not really part of that process at all. So when working with DragonBear Studios, I go away with questions for the community, and I'll return with not only a yes or no response to what we are looking at putting in is respectful, but a lot of ideas have come from these consultations, and this will push the game further to create a more sense of like rich authenticity for it. You should also be aware that there might occasionally be someone who is unhappy with what you've created. But people's opinions will be varied, as in any community and with any game, and you can only do your best. It's really important to note that you cannot consult with everybody. As I said earlier, there are hundreds of tribes all over Australia. And when it comes to stories, there are crossovers, and there's different stories for different animals and different events that happen. As a suggestion I could make is that when you're developing your game, is to make it clear that you have collaborated with Indigenous peoples, who you have consulted with, and where those inspirations have actually come from. Another thing to be aware of is that some stories and knowledge is sacred. Particularly, there is men's and women's business that we do not share across genders. Ridiculous, in my opinion. But that's just how culture was. That's how it was back in those days. And there are things, and that's something that I'll respect. So just being aware of there are stories and content out there that is pretty sacred to us and that we hold within ourselves. So if something comes up and it's a little bit funny, that might be the reason. But as long as you've consulted and done it in a respectful manner with a major focus on including Indigenous people in your design process, then you're doing great. With my father, I worked as a cultural mentor to young kids. I also studied game design at RMIT and work in the industry with DragonBear Studios. Doing all of this has really opened my eyes to the importance of solidifying Indigenous culture in new forms and the opportunities that this could bring. It's not detrimental to make games that feature and have Indigenous content in them, but if we can, why not? Why shouldn't we have multitudes of forms and ways for everyone to access, learn, and experience the culture of the First Nations, my people? Games are becoming more and more accessible with a wide range of audiences playing them and a wide range of benefits. Why not put Indigenous stories and knowledge into a form where technology is evolving and present it like now? Doing this is one way for non-Indigenous people to learn something about Indigenous culture via a new and different medium. This doesn't only apply to Australian Aboriginal culture, but every culture in the world. Imagine experiencing and interacting, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Interacting with stories from all over the world and finishing a game knowing you've just experienced something from a completely different culture from the other side of the planet that you knew nothing about. Today's games are hugely westernized. When we look at the major genres like fantasy, action-adventure, RPGs, MMOs, etc. But when you break it down, you can intertwine culture into any of these genres. Imagine an action-adventure game about exploring and finding artifacts in the Australian outback, or a fantasy game using Indigenous monsters and lore. So these may not be the most original ideas, but I came up with these on the spot. Imagine what you can create when you've spent months or possibly years fleshing out and unfolding ideas and when you've sought input from the community. We have a major opportunity to have culture expressed through video games. If you ask me what are some games that currently exist out there that are Indigenous or have Aboriginal culture in the content, I couldn't really give you a great answer, like I could if you asked me about the most popular first-person shooters. But I could say that I know they're out there, but there can always be more, and I really hope that we can get to a place where I could tell you straight up the fortnight of Indigenous cultural games. Games provide a new opportunity for cultural education across many different groups of people, not only for Western kids or teens, but also for young Aboriginal people who may not have access or knowledge about their own culture. Games also provide an opportunity for raising awareness around social issues. This could be a huge step into breaking down stereotypes and closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So a major inspiration of mine is the game Never Alone, developed by Upper One Games and Eline Media. Has anyone in the room actually played this game before? Awesome, so you know. So if you haven't heard of it, it's a game about a young Inupiat girl who braves a blizzard with her fox friends to find her tribe. The developers worked with Alaskan native storytellers and developed a game that is unique and full of traditional lore and culture. Narrated in native language, you're guided through the story as you play as the young girl and the fox to overcome monsters and the terrain. A game so rich in culture is accessible to the entire world, not just the Inupiat people, told in such a beautiful way. This story is now preserved forever in the form of this video game and the language along with it. Virtual Songlines by Bilby creates virtual experiences with ancient Indigenous culture. Amongst other projects, they have also made cultural survival games where you must learn the cultural practices to survive. The creation of these serious games goes beyond just entertainment and enjoyment. It has created a new format for holding documented information about Australia's Indigenous culture. It gives an unprecedented opportunity for anyone to experience firsthand what it's like to live as an Indigenous person before colonisation. This type of game not only shares and documents Indigenous culture, but it can provide an opportunity for Indigenous people who have never had the opportunity to learn their own culture, a chance to experience it through an interactive platform. Or an Indigenous person who's only ever grown up in the city and never had an opportunity to go outside of the city into the bush. It's not the same, but it's pretty good. It's time to start normalising other cultures too. Not only does the use of games with Indigenous content embed culture and knowledge into modern society, but it also creates many new job opportunities for Indigenous people. By getting them involved and asking to share their knowledge and be a part of the process of creating the game and bringing the stories to life, we can create more jobs. It can also be a cultural expression for those who do not know how. Sharing culture is a part of what keeps cultures alive. Paintings, stories, and songs are all traditional means of sharing culture and knowledge, but cultures evolve and adapt. Although games may not be a traditional means of sharing, creating games can become a thriving technique in embedding culture into the modern world. To do all of this, it's so important to get help from everyone. I know many people might be sitting and thinking that this doesn't really apply to them because they're not Indigenous, or they might be scared to approach it, but the fact is that we can't do it on our own. We need the help of those working in the games industry to bring our stories to life. As long as this is approached and presented in a safe and respectful manner, there's an abundance of content out there and the potential is practically unlimited. As game designers, we have so much influence over human culture and behaviours and ways of thinking. For example, I know you're going to hate these examples, but Fortnite and the whirlwinds that are the Fortnite dances. It has spread across the globe, and thanks to its popularity and accessibility. People who've never played the game know the dances. My dad is a perfect example of this. He knew the dances and did these dances to my detriment before knowing even what Fortnite was. So new cultures of cosplay and other communities have stemmed from people having shared interests and love for games. Imagine what could be achieved in society if we further explore the great potential of including Indigenous themes into games. Thank you. So I know that was a lot of me talking at you, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask now, or if you don't want to ask in front of everyone, you can come and see me after. I'm going to take that as I did really well of explaining everything.
Excuse me?
Yeah, sorry.
I was just curious in terms of, do you know of any resources or websites and stuff to get started and looking at?
Yep.
sculpture?
I was actually going to do some research onto that for this talk, but I know if you reach out to Indigenous organisations, I know there's one for Wurundjeri people, you can do a quick Google search on the internet for that. You can reach out to them. I know there's quite a few for the film industry, but I don't know how that exactly applies, but that's something I'm kind of looking into right now. So I don't know any names, sorry, right now, but yeah. Yeah?
I'm just curious, like, I know with film, for any kind of Indigenous people involved in it, like, they'll have a message saying that some people, like, essentially if they're deceased, they give you the warning.
Yeah.
Does that apply to video games? Because I know, like, they're not necessarily, they might have virtual actors or something like that, that may be Indigenous, that might need to be, like, would that apply? Is it because it's virtual, or I'm not too sure. Like, would you
I think
consider that?
that's a very good question. I've never actually thought of something like that, and personally, I think that wouldn't hurt to put in there at all. In a sense where it's somebody's voice, that could be a trigger for somebody to feel upset and miss that. So yeah, same kind of sense if it's images or even a virtual world, it's still that representation of that person. So I think definitely, yeah. Anybody else? Cool.
What's your favourite thing about working with community?
Working with community it's been a roller coaster for me. It started being super excited because this is my culture that I get to express in something that I've loved my entire life, and I never really saw myself in video games, and it never really bothered me because I never really thought about it. And what I love about it now is being able to put that to somebody else. So that's what I've really enjoyed, and getting their feedback and ideas. Like some of the ideas that have come from consultations from uncles and aunties that I've known, who I know have never played video games, is so crazy to see what they think would be funny as a video game. So that's what I really enjoy. Anybody else? Yes?
Has your research also influenced gameplay? So on one slide, the little clip we saw, there was a rule there, only take what you need.
Yes.
Whereas in traditional Western RPGs, it's, you just grab everything you can because you might need it later.
Yeah.
So has that been, have you found this contradiction? Has that influenced the design of games that you've been involved in?
Yeah, so for the game, well, I don't know about all games, but the game that we're working on, Chaos Tavern, it definitely has. It's so definitely that idea of that's such a conflict against like westernized games. So it's you take as much as you can and you hold on to it in case you need it later, right? You may not use it at all and you've just taken it from these people, you've stolen their apples or the money that they've left on their table. But yeah, it's definitely definitely influenced, and yeah. Anybody else? Okay, cool. Well, if you have any more questions later, feel free to jump on and ask me on Twitter or find me around the convention today. Thank you so much for listening.